Concerning microorganisms, let us look at some situations in which bacteria are produced. House floors were traditionally constructed of softwood such as pine or fir. These were frequently washed and lasted for decades, even when the gravel underneath was permanently wet. As new styles of interior decoration became fashionable, people wanted hardwood parquet flooring, which was laid directly over the softwood subfloor. When these parquet floors were washed, microorganisms sometimes developed and multiplied so that the superimposed flooring disintegrated in the space of a few years. In such cases, our experts maintain that the timber employed was already infected. The true facts are substantially different. The structure of fine hardwood is of a higher quality than the more coarsely grained softwood. Fine-grained wood contains qualitatively higher-grade proteins, which metabolize only rise slowly with a normal supply of oxygen. If there is sufficient space between the old lower floor and the parquet floor, so that no airtight intermediate layer can develop between the materially different types of wooden flooring, then these floors can last for decades, provided the wood is of suitable quality. If, however, the upper floor is washed and the intervening space is sealed off as the wood swells, then between both floors a warm, humid layer is created. Owing to defective waterproofing, this now obtains its air and oxygen supply from the rising groundwater in the walls. This is water that has not been exposed to the sun. The concentrated oxygen rising with the uninsulated groundwater will expand in this moist, warm, intermediate zone and become aggressive. In this condition, this highly organized oxygen first of all combines with the less complex proteins of the subfloor. The energies resulting from these metabolic processes provide the impulse for the development of certain microorganisms, which begin their vital activity at appropriate ambient temperatures and eat away the parquet floor from the bottom upwards. Different types of food and microclimate propagate different strains of these microorganisms. They eventually infest the wider environment once their original breeding ground has been destroyed. It is therefore obvious that sickening trees in the forest will also be invaded by parasites. This especially affects shade-demanding species planted by modern foresters in the open. Their sap becomes highly oxygenated and exhibits a much coarser structure. These phenomena are only the secondary and subsidiary after-effects of clear felling operations practiced over the last 100 years or so. The primary cause of the serious damage ensuing from clear felling will be addressed later. Footnote 14. These phenomena, damage to timber and underfloor decay, are discussed in greater detail in The Fertile Earth, Volume 3 of the Ecotechnology series, ed. 15 Carbones. In contrast to the normal use and definition of carbon, Victor Schauberger grouped all the known elements and their compounds, with the exception of oxygen and hydrogen, under the general classification of mother substances, which he described with the word Kohlenstoffe, normally spelt Kohlenstoffe and meaning carbon. Apart from the above definition, the hyphen also signifies a higher aspect of carbon, both physically and energetically or immaterially. The additional E in the English word is therefore intended to redefine and enlarge the scope of the usual term carbon in accordance with Victor's concepts. The question of how the microbe world comes into being and all its various preconditions cannot be usefully addressed as long as water continues to be viewed as a lifeless substance and its inner metabolic processes are not taken into account. It is always the incessant metabolic activity of and within water that generates a particular life form. Regardless of whether it is beneficial or harmful to humanity, this life form will ultimately serve the buildup of the whole. Another instructive example concerns the living conditions of the grotulm, a blind, cave-dwelling salamander of the genus Proteus, Fig. 1. If we study the water in subterranean lakes, where the influence of light is totally excluded, then in such water we find an extremely peculiar atmosphere and no microbial activity. Apart from olms present in these lakes in great number, there are no other living things. On what, then, do the olms live? The heavy concentration of oxygen in such water requires only a slight warming and a consequent increase in aggressiveness in order to transform highly complex carbones, 15 into an even higher quality, which the olm then ingests with the atmosphere contained in the water. The olm's respiratory processes and bodily heat trigger strong oxidizing phenomena, leading to the development of increased heat. Together, these are sufficient to transform highly complex carbones in the olm's body into the kind of food it requires to sustain life. On the other hand, if the olm is removed from the cave and exposed to increased oxygen, the surface of its body begins to discolor and the olm dies. However, if the olm is immediately placed in a container at the place where it was caught, and if it is not exposed to the light of day, and if warm rainwater is poured into the container, then the identical phenomena occur. Again, we encounter the same principle, which, for example, also explains the mountain trout's peaceful stance amidst rushing water. The above examples, however, are insufficient to clarify the true nature of autogenesis, spontaneous generation, which was acknowledged in the Middle Ages, but is rejected in modern times. Another simple example brings us even closer to the facts of the matter. Cho's places where very dark and glistening water streams out of the earth's surface are the spawning grounds of fish for good reason. If we examine such water at the very limit of light penetration, at the place where it first encounters incident light, a noticeable change can be detected in the matter found in such water and the first beginnings of bacterial life. The closer we approach the zone shielded from light, the more highly evolved the bacterial life in the water becomes. Conversely, bacteria are increasingly less complex the longer water flows in the light. If we observe the fish living there, the same picture emerges. The closer the fish to the spring, the tastier they are. Every fisherman knows that the powerful, stationary trout which live close to the spring spurn every type of lure. Another remarkable fact is that these fish can live for months in caverns, to which they migrate when the water subsides during the hot summer months. The feeding habits of these creatures, which spend half their lives in daylight and half underground, are substantially different to those of fish living in the lower reaches of rivers, and are similar to the lifestyle of the olm. A fact well known to alpine hunters is that the consumption of these almost blind fish leads to higher sexual potency. Another very interesting phenomenon is demonstrated by the emergence of mealworms. If a vessel containing meal is placed in a dry, warm spot, then only a few worms come alive or none at all. In order to obtain a greater quantity and better quality of worms, an old woolen cloth or a bone is placed in the meal and the lid closed. The increase in the worm population is caused by the introduced third category of carbone, whose origin stems from a group of vegetable matter more complex than the meal. Though not otherwise clarified, this would seem to infer a higher form of carbone evolving through the consumption of vegetable matter. While on the subject, a few interesting experiments can be described. If we pour a dilute solution of potassium chromate, or iron or copper sulfate, onto a moist gelatinous film, beautiful patterns of deliquescence appear, which under the magnifying glass exhibit a delicate, strongly branched structure. If river water is used to make the gelatine and the whole experimental arrangement is placed at the interface between a positive and a negative temperature gradient, after a certain time various fungi, algae, and mosses can be detected under the microscope. On the other hand, if fresh seawater is used instead of fresh water, then different flora and fauna of this microbe kingdom will appear, which are characterized by more worm-like, wriggling organisms. Under the right conditions, this microbial world behaves in the same way as its brothers and sisters in the macro-RLD. It devours everything around it while engaging in the mutual struggle for existence / excreting all unusable matter and reproducing itself with incredible speed. The results of this experiment are particularly clear if the procedure is carried out in a well-sealed glass vessel, insulated externally in order to maintain the correct temperature gradient, in this instance created artificially, and to prevent any transfer of energy to the outside. Apart from an atmosphere conducive to the formation of the desired microorganisms or worms, the presence of a third, more highly organized substance is necessary in order to activate the energies and to create the conditions. For example, a drop of oil in water of the appropriate composition. Whether the propagation of these microorganisms is caused by their own physical energy or through the effect of an artificially created temperature gradient is quite immaterial. The most important factor in both cases is the necessary alternation of the climate over short periods of time. This frees the life-generating energy at the point of intersection between the individual climatic zones, at the interface between two complementary temperature gradients. Once again, the prerequisite for the success of this experiment is the correct proportion of basic elements, the oxygen and carbone groups contained in the water. An appropriately shaped vessel with a suitable airtight seal is also required, in which the inner climate can be produced and maintained, which is suited to the respective creature and therefore necessary for its life activity. Another example can be mentioned to clarify a natural phenomenon which science has so far been unable to explain. but which can be clarified easily if we observe the circumstances that give rise to these remarkable events. These are the so-called worm rains in Lapland, which now and then happen in spring, during which it rains living white worms about 3 cm, 1 long. The usual but incorrect assumption is that these worms, which fall from the heavens under the blood-red light of the midnight sun, are somehow, somewhere caught up by wind, gathered together into a worm cloud, and at a particular location fall back to earth in their thousands. A similar curious phenomenon is the so-called rotting season that starts in Lapland towards the end of July and lasts about 4 weeks. Trees should not be felled during this period because after a few days, fungus appears in such profusion that all the work is in vain. Even heavily salted bacon is tinged with all manner of colors. The smallest wound festers and can only heal after the rotting season has passed. The same applies to animals, since any wounds they suffer during this period are also incurable. The young born in this period of purulence are often deformed. Mosquitoes and other pests die off en masse after the rotting season is over. Further proof that a certain seasonally dependent climate or particular light influences enhance the propagation of a superabundance of microorganisms is provided by epidemics that regularly occur under certain preconditions. These are caused by bacteria alone. They represent nature's most effective self-defense when the human organism foolishly interferes with the driving forces of life and nature. It is well known that varying intensities and qualities of sunlight peculiar to each season play a major role in growth. For example, if light is directed into a room through window panes of a particular color, then the flies begin to die off. However, if the color of the glass is changed, they can revive. The decrease in tuberculosis since radio waves first vibrated through the ether is also no accident. These emissions cause an unbalanced and excessive concentration of oxygen both in water and the atmosphere, which goes a long way towards explaining why human beings have become faster living, more hot-tempered, but regrettably less intelligent in the process. Studies of Earth rays and the appearance of symptoms of cancerous decay frequently associated with them reveal that these can also be traced back to interactive processes in the interior of the Earth, which have been impaired locally. These have been unfavorably affected by shifts in the distribution of groups of basic elements, for which groundwater acts as a conveyor, distributing them to all life via the soil's capillaries. All these phenomena, so mystifying to science, can be duplicated or prevented once the nature of the primal substance of all life, the nature of water, is understood.